Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into the staggering rise and, honestly, the devastatingly rapid collapse of the largest global superpower in history. We're looking at the British Empire, mapping out exactly how it built itself into an absolute titan, held a quarter of the globe together, and then vanished so incredibly fast that the people living inside it barely noticed until it was already just a memory. To really wrap our heads around the sheer scale of this phenomenon, we gotta start at the absolute peak. Picture this, it's 1920. And the British Empire controls 24% of Earth's total land area. We're talking an empire where the sun literally never set, stretching across continents, oceans, and time zones. Across all of these sprawling territories, 1 in every 4 humans on the planet was a British subject. That is a mind-boggling 412 million people, all living under the rule of one single, rather small, perpetually rainy island.
But here is the truly wild part. In just 50 years, this unrivaled, unprecedented superpower completely collapsed. It didn't happen gradually over centuries, and it definitely wasn't a graceful retreat. The largest empire ever constructed in human history was just suddenly, abruptly gone. So, how on earth does a superpower with its tendrils in every corner of the map shrink to almost nothing in the blink of a historical eye?
Part 1. Building a global empire. Let's map out exactly how a rainy, seemingly insignificant island off the coast of Europe managed to conquer the globe in the first place. You know, Britain didn't actually start out as an empire. They started as a potential victim. Back in 1588, the Spanish Armada attempted an invasion of the island and completely failed. But that singular moment taught Britain a vital lesson. They realized, hey, as an island nation, we need to conquer oceans rather than land. Their early formula was brilliantly simple. Don't conquer territory, control the trade. And they utilized private corporations to do the heavy lifting, most notably the East India Company. Imagine a modern tech giant, like Apple or Google, having its own sprawling infantry, warships, and court systems. That was the East India Company. By 1757, this single private company controlled Bengal, the richest province in India, effectively ruling over 30 million people. So it wasn't a king running the early empire. It was a CEO.
The empire size absolutely exploded following the 7 Years' War, which ended in 1763. This was a truly global conflict against France, fought simultaneously across the forests of America, the plains of India, and the coasts of Africa. When the dust finally settled, Britain had won outright. They stripped massive territories away from their competitors, taking Canada from France, Florida from Spain, and securing total dominance in India. They essentially transformed their corporate trading posts into the beginnings of a true territorial empire.
And this brings us to a really fascinating demographic paradox. How did they achieve all of this global expansion? Well, Britain built this vast empire with a home population of just 8 million people. To put that into perspective, Spain had 15 million and France had 25 million. Britain was tiny. But while France relied heavily on a sprawling peasant farm economy, Britain had industrialized. They had factories, complex machinery, and steam engines. Their ultimate advantage wasn't their physical size or numbers, it was their incredible speed and an absolute technological edge.
Part 2. The Peak of British Power. By 1815, Napoleon is decisively defeated, ushering in the undisputed height of British global dominance.
Check out this data from 1860. It is just staggering. A single island was producing 20% of all manufactured goods on Earth, leaving the remaining 80% to the entire rest of the world combined. At this point, the Royal Navy had more active warships than the next 3 navies put together, ensuring their trade routes were completely impenetrable. Meanwhile, British banks were the ultimate financiers of global trade, bankrolling infrastructure projects on nearly every continent.
But here's the thing. The empire wasn't just held together by the heavy cannons of the Royal Navy. It was cemented through an invisible empire of culture and daily habit. The pound sterling functioned as the global reserve currency, essentially the US dollar of its day. English became the absolute standard language for global business and diplomacy. Cultural exports like cricket spread deep into the societies of India, Australia, and the Caribbean. And perhaps most critically, British common law became the foundation for legal systems spanning from Canada all the way down to Singapore. The empire was quite literally held together by the everyday habits of billions.
However, that massive peak hit a quiet, relentless decline. Britain's global manufacturing share plummeted to 15% by 1890. While Britain rested comfortably on the laurels of its vast empire, places like the United States and Germany were industrializing rapidly. They were hungrier, they were building bigger factories and inventing better machines for the future. So the slow, quiet fall of the British Empire was actually beginning decades before anyone in London even really noticed.
Which brings us to Part 3. World Wars break the empire. these two massive global conflicts fundamentally shattered the psychological and economic foundation that held this sprawling network together.
The first really major, visible cracks appeared with World War I. The conflict cost Britain a staggering generation of men, 1 million lives lost. But honestly, even more dangerously for the stability of the empire, it irrevocably shattered their long-held myth of invincibility. The colonies watched Britain bleed and struggle in the trenches of Europe. Indian and African soldiers who fought and died for the British Empire returned home fundamentally changed. After bleeding in the mud for a distant king, they looked at the discrimination and poverty around them and finally started demanding their own freedom.
And on top of that catastrophic human cost, the First World War completely bankrupted the treasury. To simply survive the conflict, Britain was forced to borrow $4.7 billion from the United States, which is the equivalent of about $100 billion today. In a flash, this seismic shift transformed Britain from the world's greatest creditor to an overwhelming debtor. Suddenly, the empire was rapidly becoming a massive, unmanageable financial burden rather than a profitable asset.
Then came World War II, which just pushed the already strained empire far past its breaking point. Britain was forced to heavily rely on its colonies for survival, deploying 2.5 million Indian soldiers and 1 million African soldiers to fight the Axis powers. But after fighting, bleeding, and dying for Britain's freedom, these millions of soldiers returned home with an uncompromising demand: immediate independence for themselves. This sparked fierce, absolutely unstoppable anti-colonial movements led by visionary figures like Gandhi, Nehru, and Nkrumah.
Part 4. The shocking 50-year collapse. This brings us right to the incredibly rapid, single-generation collapse of the largest empire ever built.
The sheer speed of this collapse is just hard to wrap your head around. In 1945, Britain still controlled roughly 700 million people worldwide. Just 20 years later, by 1965, that number had plummeted to a mere 5 million. In a span of just 2 decades, the empire lost an astonishing 99% of its population, as sprawling territories across India, the Middle East, Africa, and the Caribbean rapidly gained their independence. No empire in recorded history, not Rome, not the Mongols, has ever collapsed this incredibly fast.
So why did it fall apart with such velocity? Well, the source data points to 3 main reasons working together like a geopolitical vice grip. First, Britain was simply broke. They literally could not afford the military budget required to fight 50 different independence movements simultaneously. Second, the United States actively pressured Britain to decolonize because America wanted open global markets to sell their own goods, not closed-off British monopolies. And third, the Soviet Union was actively supporting, arming, and funding these anti-colonial rebellions. Britain was essentially caught completely defenseless between 2 new superpowers who both wanted the old empire dismantled.
And this financial ruin leads to a crazy, almost tragic twist with the Maldives. The Maldives is a tiny, beautiful island nation in the Indian Ocean. And surprisingly, they actually begged to remain part of the British Empire, but they were forced into independence. Why? Because Britain simply couldn't afford the administrative budget. The Maldives lacked basic infrastructure and prepared leadership at the time, but Britain couldn't afford to keep them, nor could they afford to help them transition properly. The empire didn't end with a grand, fiery finale. It ended with a bleak budget cut. Part 5. What outlasts an empire? Now that the vast territories have vanished and the borders have been permanently redrawn, we must look at what actually survives when an empire's hard military power disappears completely.
Today, the modern nation of Britain controls just 0.2% of Earth's territory. They went from dominating a quarter of the globe and commanding the oceans to settling for mere survival on their rainy island. The hard territory, the physical land itself, is entirely gone.
However, while the physical land was lost, the empire successfully exported the ultimate cultural software, and it's still quietly running the globe today. Think about it. The English language is spoken by 1.5 billion people. British common law governs the fundamental legal systems of 2 billion people, and cricket is fiercely played and followed by 2.5 billion people. The empire took the land temporarily, but it left behind a permanent, incredibly resilient software of daily habits, laws, and language that still deeply govern the lives of billions globally right now.
Britain lost its land in just 50 years, but it successfully exported a cultural world over 400 years that remains fully intact today. Power, territory, and wealth are historically temporary, but culture clearly outlasts all of it. This leaves us with a truly fascinating question to ponder. Which form of empire is truly more powerful, and which one actually lasts longer? The military empire that violently draws the physical borders, or the cultural empire that quietly writes the rules? Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the history around you.